Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is A Game of You. Now, A Game of You is a graphic novel written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by several different artists and published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC Comics. And this is the fifth graphic novel in Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. The first four books in this series being Preludes and Nocturnes, The Doll's House, Dream Country, and Season of Mist. Now, I have reviewed the first four Sandman graphic novels, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you could go check out those reviews. Now, this entire graphic novel series was originally published in single magazine form, and it was published between the years 1989 and 1996. Now, keep in mind, I have not yet read all the volumes of this series, and so far I want to say Season of Mist might be my favorite. However, this is probably a close second. Now, this whole series deals with the concept that what if when we dream, we're actually going into another dimension, and the series follows a character named Morpheus, who is the king of this other dimension, and Morpheus is part of a group of celestial beings called the Endless, who are older than time and space, and are even older than God himself. Now, the Judeo-Christian God does exist in this universe because angels have shown up in this series, and Satan was also a major character in Preludes and Nocturnes and Season of Mist. However, this series also incorporates elements of so many other religions and mythologies. Like, there are aspects of Greek mythology in this series, there are aspects of Norse mythology and Egyptian mythology. And on top of that, this series also takes a lot of stuff from fairy tales and folklore. Now, the plot of A Game of You is it follows a young woman named Barbara, or Barbie as she's mostly called. Now, we were first introduced to this character in The Doll's House. Now, following the events of The Doll's House, Barbie is living in New York City, and her best friend is a transsexual named Wanda. Now, because of something that happened in The Doll's House, Barbie can no longer dream, but when she used to dream that she was the princess of this magical world called the Land. But, as was established in the series already, dreams are more real than we think, so it turns out that the Land and all the creatures that inhabit it are in fact real to a certain extent, and since Barbie's absence, the Land has been taken over by a creature called the Cuckoo. And it turns out that one of the tenants in Barbie's apartment building, this real creepy guy named George, is actually a disciple of the Cuckoo. Now, in the story, Barbie discovers that her dreams are more real than she thinks when a character from her dreams, a wolf-like creature named Martin Tenbones, comes into the real world and gives her this magical stone. Eventually, she ends up falling into sort of a supernaturally induced coma. So in the story, Barbie ends up back in the Land, and she ends up joining this resistance against the Cuckoo. Meanwhile, in the real world, the Cuckoo's children are fucking with the women in this apartment building. Eventually, the women in this apartment building figure out what's going on, and this woman named Thessaly, if I'm saying her name right, who's actually a witch, gets them all to perform a ritual which allows them to physically enter the dream world. Now, as I pointed out already, A Game of You is probably my second favorite of this series so far. Even though Morpheus, who is the main character of this series overall, even though he really doesn't have a lot to do with this one, like he does make a few brief appearances, and he has a major appearance at the end of this story, really this graphic novel is not about Morpheus. As I pointed out already, really Barbie is the main character of this comic. And I actually like that. I like how, even though he's the main character of the series overall, the series is not just about him, it's also about the people he affects. Another thing I like about this graphic novel, but this is something I enjoy about the Sandman series overall, is this combination of fantasy and realism. Like, the stuff taking place in the real world really does feel realistic. Like, it feels very much grounded in reality, but the stuff taking place in the dream world, particularly the land, really does feel like high fantasy. And truth be told, that's my favorite kind of fantasy, the kind of fantasy that has some sort of connection with reality, because if you set your fantasy story more or less in the real world, that makes the fantastical elements more believable, in my opinion. But this is not just a fantasy comic, this is very much a horror comic as well. Like, what Thessaly does to George in this story is pretty horrific. And also in this graphic novel, there's a part where the Cuckoo's children are causing the tenants in this apartment building to have these horrific nightmares. I was particularly disturbed by Hazel's dream. Hazel is this lesbian who lives in the apartment building, who you find out before the events of this graphic novel, when she was drunk she had a sexual encounter with a male coworker of hers, and now she's pregnant. In Hazel's dream, her and her girlfriend have these two babies, one living, one dead, and then the dead one comes to life and tears the other baby's throat out and its stomach out, and that was such a horrific scene for a comic book, and that's something that you know if they made a movie based on the Sandman comics, they would never be able to get away with that in a movie. And Hazel's girlfriend, Foxgrove, you find out in this comic was actually the ex-girlfriend of the character of Judy, who was one of Dr. Destiny's victims in Preludes and Nocturnes. Dr. Destiny was the main villain of that graphic novel. And in Foxgrove's nightmare, she's visited by the ghost of Judy. But there aren't just horrific moments in this comic, there are also some really emotional and heartbreaking moments in this graphic novel as well. For example, what happens with Martin Tenbones, I don't want to give it away, but it's so freaking heartbreaking. And also, the ending of this graphic novel is very emotionally moving. This graphic novel also very much has a feminist undercurrent. Like, in here there's a lot of commentary on gender issues like misogyny and homophobia and transphobia and gender roles. And in here, there's very much a commentary on this whole idea of men should be men, and women should be women, and boys should be boys, and girls should be girls. And there's a lot of commentary in here about how, in our society, men and women are expected to act a certain way. And there's very much a criticism in here of this whole idea of comic books being exclusively for males, and there's very much sort of a commentary on sexism in comic book fandom. Like, in this book, you find out that Wanda is a comic book fan, and then Barbie says to her, "My dad never let me read comics, he said they were unladylike." And then there's a scene at the end where Barbie is in a comic book store, and the store owner is making these blatantly sexist and genuinely creepy comments towards her. So once again, this graphic novel very much has sort of a feminist bent to it, and it is a very feminine story because most of the characters in here are female. Now, I forgot to talk about this in my other Sandman reviews, but I love how Morpheus is drawn to look like Robert Smith from The Cure. And I feel like if they do end up doing a movie based on these comics, it should be set in either the late 80s or early 90s. And I really do love the whole goth rock aesthetic that these comics have. And I don't know if you would get that same feeling if they did a movie based on the Sandman series, but set it in modern day. Now, I said in my review of Preludes and Nocturnes that I could totally see Tim Burton back in his heyday doing an adaptation of these comic books, but the more that I think about it, had they done a Sandman movie back in the 90s, I actually think Alex Proyas, who directed The Crow, would have done a fantastic Sandman film, because stylistically, I do think there are a lot of similarities between Sandman and Crow. So once again, I highly recommend A Game of You. I thought it was a great addition to this series, and an excellent graphic novel in general. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Mark Allan Gunnells did on this graphic novel. He's a huge fan of the Sandman series, and is a huge fan of Neil Gaiman in general.
Hello, Mark Gunnells here. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review on the Sandman graphic novel A Game of You by Neil Gaiman. This is actually one of my favorites of the story arcs of the Sandman series. It's one that I don't think is as popular with a lot of fans. It's actually kind of light on the involvement of Morpheus, the Sandman. And it's a very odd story that takes a disparate group of characters and sort of throws them together into this dream world. The main character is actually Barbie, who was a small side character in A Doll's House. But she's really explored here and given a lot of depth, a lot of complexity. Her best friend is a transsexual named Wanda, who I think is an absolutely brilliant character that is fascinating. There are a lot of really interesting female characters here, and there's also some commentary on females in the comic book world, both female characters in comic books and the lack of female fans traditionally for comics. But you know, all that subtext aside, I think it's just a really interesting, fascinating story that takes you into the dream world to a degree that I don't feel you had been in some of the previous story arcs. The ending to me is just very moving, heartbreaking, emotional. It leaves you kind of emotionally raw at the end, but it has that much power to it. I'm a huge fan of this graphic novel.
I hope you enjoyed Mark's short review on this comic, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall. So that was my review on the Sandman Volume 5, A Game of You by Neil Gaiman, and bye.